Welcome everybody to this really wonderful day of learning, and I thank all the organizers for Torah on the West Coast, Torah LA. It's a very special privilege to be a part of this, but I also have to thank all the leadership of Yachad for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful day of learning, but also for giving me the opportunity to be involved with their wonderful work, with their wonderful activity that Yachad does every single day, helping many of the members throughout the country of our community who have disabilities and giving them a more meaningful and more purposeful life. So we thank Yachad, and I'm privileged to be a very small part, a very small cog on the wheel of everything that Yachad does. And that is the topic that I was given today, just to focus a little bit on the importance of thinking about other Jews, the importance of being giving and being understanding of other Jews. And it's always an important topic. It's certainly an important topic now in today's climate, where we find that there's such a disregard, there's such a sense of disrespect for those who might be a little bit different than we are, for those who think differently than we may think, for those who act a little bit differently than we may act. And it's an important conversation for us to have. There's a very fascinating Gemara in the beginning of Maseches Sotah, where the Gemara tells us that the bookends, which means the underlying theme of all of Torah, can be boiled down to one idea, and that is Torah tchilasa gemilas chasadim, v'sofa gemilas chasadim. The Gemara tells us that it is not coincidental that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to start off the entirety of Torah with the story of gemilas chasadim, of the Ribono Shel Olam creating man and providing him with everything that he needed, and the very end of Chumash ends off with gemilas chasadim as well. As the Gemara tells us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, bichvodo va'atzmo, God took out of his own schedule, God in some way lowered himself to be involved in the burial of Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore what the Gemara is teaching us here is that this is not just one of the important lessons of Torah, but this perhaps is the underlying theme of all of Torah. When we observe the experiences as religious Jews, when we perform the many mitzvahs that we do, we remind ourselves that the Torah begins and ends with gemilas chasadim. It is not just a mitzvah like any other. It is so fundamentally important, which is why the Gemara says in Maseches Yevamos Ayin Tes that there are three ways that you can have a recognizable behavior in a human being and know that they are really Jews. And it doesn't mean to say that others in the world don't have this, but this is the hallmark, the signature characteristic of what a Jew is meant to represent. And this is what is expected of every Jew. So the Gemara tells us, Shlosha simanim b'umazu. There are three different things that should be present and are expected to be present in the life of every good Jew. And that is number one, rachmanim, that they are merciful, that they are kind, that they are compassionate and caring. Number two, says the Gemara, baishanim, that they have a little bit of a sense of busha. And number three, gomlei chasadim, that we go out and we help others and we are actively engaged in that, which is what the Gemara says in Maseches Sotah. One of the most important mitzvahs in the Torah that we have is the mitzvah behalachta b'drachav. Rav Soloveitchik writes in many of his writings how important it is that we always throughout life try our best to do whatever we can to imitate the way of life of God, to imitate the ways of God, the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu portrayed himself to us. We are expected to emulate that. We are expected in some way to try to measure our behavior up to the behavior of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara says, how can that be? The pasuk on the one hand says, Acharei Hashem Elokecha Telechun, you're supposed to follow HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and on the other hand the Gemara says, Ki Hashem Elokecha Eish Ochla, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is an all-consuming fire, and we cannot get too close. So how do you reconcile these two apparent psukim that seem to be going at odds with one another? And the Gemara says, Ella, it must mean to teach us that we have an obligation to emulate HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It doesn't mean to follow him in close proximity, but it means to do whatever we can to be as much in line with the lifestyle that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has envisioned for us. And that is number one, says the Gemara, Mahu malbish harumim, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes out of his way to clothe those who do not have clothing, like we find by Adam Harishon, so too we should be engaged in acts of halbashas arumim. Mahu mevaker cholim, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mevaker chola. when Avraham Avinu was not feeling well, after the Bris Milah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent angels. And so too says the Gemara, HaKadosh Baruch Hu nichem avelim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes out of his way to be menachem and avel. So too says the Gemara, our expectation as Jews is to do the very same, to be involved in acts of chesed. My father told me once in the name of Rav Shay Schachter a beautiful comment. There's another Gemara, Masechah Shabbos, where we're told, Zeh keli va'anvehu, that we have an obligation to emulate the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there the Gemara says, Mahu racham v'chanon, just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is caring, compassionate, and merciful, so too we should act in the very same way. Why do we need two different Gemaras teaching us the very same lesson from two different psukim? It would seem to be the same lesson that is learned from both. Why do I need it to be learned, number one, from Zeh keli va'anvehu, which means havei domelo, try to emulate, try to be similar in some way to the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. On the other hand, we have a Gemara Masechah Sota that tells us from a different pasuk, Acharei Hashem Elokecha Telechun. My father told me that Rav Soloveitchik suggested that perhaps the reason why is because these are addressing two different kinds of people. You have some people in the world that are very caring and very sensitive and very compassionate. But they say to themselves, I don't have the ability to actually be helpful in a meaningful way. So I'll sit and I'll cry and I'll feel sorry. And I really do genuinely and sincerely feel very sorry for whatever situation I see in front of me that is not perfect. But I don't stand up and do anything. That is insufficient. Mahu racham v'chanun, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is caring, compassionate, and merciful, but that is not enough. The Gemara tells us one also has to be active. One cannot just be in their heart, in their mind. One cannot just have a feeling. One also has to make sure that they actively do something with those feelings. They are malbish arumim, they are menachem avelim, they are kover mesim. They do something with the feeling and with the sense of caring and compassion that they have for others. On the other hand, the Gemara says it goes in the other direction as well, and that is, there are some people in the world that are so involved, that are so active in many different areas of life that are helpful to other people. There are people who join the Chevra Kadisha. There are people who join the Bikur Cholim clubs, and they're always on the Chesed committees. And there are doctors and there are nurses who give all of their time to help other people and to selflessly give of themselves to other people. But yet, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, individuals that are involved in this on a day-to-day basis lose that sense of passion, lose that sense of feeling, lose that sense of understanding for other people, because this is just their job, this is their profession, this is what they do every single day. And the Gemara teaches us that too is not sufficient. We must make sure to actively be involved, to be kover mesim, to be menachem avelim, to be menachem avel, and to do everything that is expected of a person to do actively as an asset to the Jewish community. But more than that, the Gemara says it's not sufficient. The Gemara says we also have to be mahu racham v'chanun. Just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is caring, compassionate, and merciful, as much as we're involved in acts of kindness in helping other people, we always need to remember as well at the same time that there's an expectation of us to always be mindful and to always be having a sense of feeling and understanding for the recipient of whatever it is that we give them. Rabbeinu Yonah writes in his beautiful Sefer Shari Tshuva, and it's important Sefer for us to be aware of. Rabbeinu Yonah has so many important lessons for our lives, but he says, Yesh mitzvah saseh min hachamuros. There is a mitzvah that I'd like to point out, says Rabbeinu Yonah, that is so important. She'ein hamon ha'am nizharim bahen. That many people neglect, that many people seem to overlook, and they don't pay attention to. Kegon, for example, and he gives a whole list, but one of them that he mentions is Gemilas Chasadim. That Gemilas Chasadim seems to fall into a category of all mitzvahs. And people either have time for it or they don't, but says Rabbeinu Yonah, it should not be in the same category as others. Gemilas Chasadim is so fundamental to who we are as a people. And we dare not neglect, we dare not overlook this important mitzvah. As the Gemara says in Masechah Sota, Gedola Gemilas Chasadim Yoser Min Tzedakah. Sometimes it's easier for us to just write out a check. Somebody comes to the house. Just last night I had somebody who came, and such an unfortunate story, and it was so sad. And I don't have a lot of means, but I gave him whatever I was able to give just to help out his situation. I tried my best. But then he asked me for more. He said, Rabbi Schachter, more than I want your check, it would be very helpful to me if you made a few phone calls. It would be very helpful to me if you were actively involved in helping me. And that is sometimes a much more difficult task. That is the difference between tzedakah and gemilas chasadim. The Gemara says in Maseches Sukkah, as we mentioned, that gedola gemilas chasadim yoser min tzedakah. More than the check that you give are the phone calls that you make, are the going out of our way, is the being kind, is the being understanding of this person. It's not so important how much money we end up giving or don't end up giving. More important to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is for us to be gomlei chasadim. It's more important than tzedakah. Ask the Gemara why. Why would you say that gemilas chasadim is fundamentally more important than tzedakah? And the Gemara comes to the following few conclusions. Number one, says the Gemara, because gemilas chasadim is bein la'aniyim ubein la'ashirim. When we do acts of gemilas chasadim, that can be something that is able to benefit somebody who is of means and somebody who potentially is not. The mitzvah of tzedakah is limited to one who needs help financially. If you have a wealthy individual who is self-sufficient, who takes care of themselves, whose family is taken care of, we don't need to give them tzedakah. So therefore, says the Gemara, on the one hand, tzedakah is wonderful, but it's very limiting in its scope. When we talk about gemilas chasadim, that is universal. We can do a chesed for anybody, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of what's going on in their home. We can always do a chesed for another person. So unfortunately, I was just in the hospital with my son a week and a half ago. Baruch Hashem, everything's okay now. But as we were in the hospital, I was thinking to myself, these nurses are working so hard. I don't have to give them a tip. They're being paid by the hospital, and I don't think they would accept a tip. But I said, they're probably self-sufficient. They get paid nicely, or I hope they do. But I can do something else for them. I don't have to give them tzedakah. They're probably not looking for my charity. But I'm able to do a chesed. And I went down every day to go to the cafeteria, and I came back up with 15 cups of coffee, and I gave it out to everybody. You know what? Regardless of who you are, it feels good for a person to do a chesed for you. Doesn't matter if you have enough money to buy your own coffee. And I'm sure all of them were able to afford it. The point being that gemilas chasadim is something that's able to benefit anybody and everybody, regardless of who you are. And therefore, number one, says the Gemara, gemilas chasadim is more powerful than tzedakah because gemilas chasadim is something that is able to be done not only for an ani, but also for an ashir. Number two, says the Gemara, one of the major differences is that gemilas chasadim, as opposed to tzedakah, is able to be done not just bimamono, but also bigufo. You see, I can do a chesed for another person by writing out a check, but that again is limited in its scope. Gemilas chasadim is so much greater than that. Gemilas chasadim gives me the ability to use my ears to listen to a person. Sometimes I don't even have to say anything. I had someone recently who unfortunately lost a child, and I really have nothing to say. I really don't think there are good answers that I can potentially give to such a person. What a horrifically painful experience. But when we have a situation like that, one thing we can give is our ears, is our attention, is just to give the person the ability to talk to us. Gemilas chasadim is us understanding that it's not just about money. Yes, I can give money to an organization, and that's wonderful, and we should. We should not understate that, but the Gemara says something so much more than that is when I can use not only my monetary resources, not only mamono, but also to use gufo, when I use my own body, when I use my hands to help the other person, when I use my ears, when I use my mouth, when I do so many different activities to be helpful to another human being. That puts gemilas chasadim over, above, and beyond the act of charity, the act of tzedakah. It is so much more powerful. And therefore, says Rabbeinu Yonah, when we talk about mitzvahs that are potentially neglected, Rabbeinu Yonah writes in the Shari Tshuva that it's important for us to think about not only how we spend our money, not only allocating those funds properly, because tzedakah is a very important mitzvah, but even more fundamentally important is the idea of gemilas chasadim. And unfortunately, he says, Ein ha'am nizharim bazeh. So many people are not careful. So many people don't make time in their daily schedules to have a time carved out when they will do something that is a kindness for another person. So somebody once mentioned to me, I'm in the office. What am I able to do by the time I get home at night? I'm really unable to do that much chesed. People are already in their homes. They're already sleeping. And I said to him, how about every Erev Shabbos? You go out of your way to call somebody who is living alone. That can be a single man, a single woman. It could be an almana. It can be a yasom. It can be somebody who just would appreciate a little text or a little message or a little phone call from you, straight from your office. It will take no more than 2 to 5 minutes. Just think about how much that can do for another person. And again, it doesn't cost you anything, but it's something that is such a meaningful gesture to the recipient. And therefore, says Rabbeinu Yonah, Zos min ha-chamuros umin ha-ikarim ha-nidrashim min ha-adam. This, to me, says Rabbeinu Yonah, is one of the primary expectations of a human being. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Sefer Micha, Higid lecha adam atov u'ma Hashem daresh mimcha. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu expect of us? Does He expect everything of us? Says the Navi, no, we can boil it down. Yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to put on tefillin, He wants us to keep Shabbos and Kashrus and all these other things that are so important to what it means to be a Jew. But says the Navi Micha, if you want to boil it down in a very simple term, all you need to know is the following. Higid lecha adam atov u'ma Hashem daresh mimcha. What is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us? Kiyam asos chesed, asos mishpat, ve'avas chesed, ve'hatznei aleches im elokecha. And in that list is asos chesed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be engaged in the act of chesed. And that is so much an important aspect of what our lives are meant to represent. You know, every year before Rosh Hashanah, we always have people in our community, and I'm sure it's the same by you in California and on the West Coast, who are looking for all kinds of skulas. We live in a generation where everybody wants a skula, everybody wants the quick fix for any problem that they potentially have. So they say, should I go to this makubal, should I fly to Eretz Yisrael and talk to this great tzaddik or that great person? And all of those are wonderful things, and I don't want to make light of it. But the greatest skula of them all is to look at what the Gemara says, which is the following. You want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to have Rachmanas on you. There are so many people today who are out of a job, so many people today who not only are unemployed, but because of that their shalom bayis is in shambles, and because of that their children are having issues, and because of that the schools are having issues. And there are so many things, there are so many needs that we have. We need HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Rachmanas. So many people are sick, and so many people are having just a myriad of issues. There's no end to the amount of problems that unfortunately we all face today. But yet, the Gemara says, Kal hamerachem al habrios, merachamim alav min hashamayim. If you are willing to be caring, compassionate, and sensitive to others, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will do the same. The Baal Shem Tov once commented, the pasuk says in Tehillim, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. The Baal Shem Tov very beautifully commented that perhaps what it means is, the Ribono Shel Olam is my shadow. And the same way when I make a movement and I move my hands, the shadow will do the same. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does the same thing. When I am caring and compassionate to other people, HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds in kind, and the Ribono Shel Olam sees those acts and decides that He is going to be our shadow, that He is going to follow our behavior, and He will respond in our lives in the very same way. Is there a greater skula in the world that we can look for when there are times in our lives when we feel that we need the Rachmanus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is there a greater skula in the world than that which Chazal tell us? And that is Kal hamerachem al habrios, merachamim alav min hashamayim. One of the great tzaddikim in the end of the 1600s was Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. He was known to be the Gadol Hador. He was the Rav of Prague, Altona, Hamburg, and Mainz, really prominent communities in Europe, one of the great Gedolim of Poland. And Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz writes in his beautiful Sefer Yaros Devash, Eich yoiz ish lomar. You know what's amazing about this comment? I've read this bracha so many times in our daily Shmona Esrei. And until I saw this comment, it never dawned on me to think in this way. But sometimes it takes seeing a great comment of a great leader, of a great Jewish thinker, to open our eyes to something that we're so familiar with. So I hope that this will impact your Shmona Esrei the same way it has impacted mine from the day that I saw this the very first time. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz writes so beautifully in the Yaros Devash, Ech yayiz ha'ish lomar. How is it that a person can dare say in Shmona Esrei, Magein Avraham? The end of the first bracha in Shmona Esrei is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the Magein Avraham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu protected Avraham Avinu. Ask Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, what right do you have to say Magein Avraham? Almost to say as if, the same way you protected Avraham Avinu, I want you to protect me, I want you to look after me. Right? So Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, V'hu eno sam leiv laleches be'ikvosav. We don't always follow in the ways of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was Amud HaChesed. His whole life represented Chesed. Avraham Avinu was selfless. He was always doing for other people. Says Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, you want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be living your kind of life of Rachmanus. You want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be Magein Avraham, to protect you? The greatest way to ensure that is to live a life as Avraham Avinu did. Lifkoach b'chol iske koshel, to take responsibility for anybody who has an issue. Ulekabel masha yikra lo Hashem be'ava. Says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, the only way that one can have such a request of HaKadosh Baruch Hu of Magein Avraham, and therefore you should be Magein on me and my family, is if we pledge to live a life that is similar to the life of Avraham Avinu. It's if we pledge to live a life which is also one that highlights Chesed, that is the Amud HaChesed. And it's only then that we have a right to demand and we have a right to request of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that He should look after us and He should guard us. I think this is such an important lesson, especially now, when we have so much Rachmanas to ask for, when we have so much protection that we need. You know, David HaMelech says, Shamra Nafshi, he begs HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He had a difficult life. David HaMelech was a fugitive. David HaMelech had so many adversaries. David HaMelech had a very, very difficult life, and he overcame so many challenges. But at one point, David HaMelech says, Shamra Nafshi, look after me. And you would ask yourself, if you stop the pasuk there, and you were David HaMelech, what would you end the sentence with? Why do you think you're deserving of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's protection? Why do you think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be Shomer Alecha? What have you done in your life, David HaMelech, that warrants that kind of request? Well, I have a long litany of things that I can put on there. If I was David HaMelech, I can say, I am the Melech Yisrael. I'm looking after all their needs. I am a very righteous person. I've studied Torah, and I have uplifted the experience of Jews all over the world. David HaMelech has so much to say for himself. Chatzos laila akum lahodas lecha Hashem. David HaMelech gets up every night in the middle of the night at Chatzos to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to learn Torah, to do everything that he's supposed to do and more. David HaMelech was involved in every facet of Jewish community, of Jewish life, and he never felt anything was beneath him. But there's none of that he mentions in his request. Shamra Nafshi, says the pasuk. Why does David HaMelech feel he has a right to say that God should protect him? Ki Chassid ani, because I am a Chassid. Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch comments in one of his svarim, what does it mean, Ki Chassid ani? What does it mean to be a Chassid? Well, it obviously does not mean to be a Hasidic Jew, a Hasidic Yid. That's not what the Torah means when it says Chassid. Chasidim are named after the term Chassid, because Chassid means a pious individual. But what is the definition of Chassid? Writes Rav Hirsch, Chassid means a person who lives a selfless life. David HaMelech writes, God, I feel I have a right to ask you for protection. Shamra Nafshi, look after my soul, make sure I don't get hurt, make sure my life is going to be okay. Why? Ki Chassid ani, because I have pledged to live a life of selflessness, because I give every moment of my life for other people, because I'm so understanding of them, and I'm so forthcoming to their needs. And therefore, David HaMelech says, as a result of that, I feel I'm in a position to ask for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Shmira. Is there a greater thing that we can ask for today than that? And the Chafetz Chaim points out to us, we're all familiar that he has an obligation of a Hagisa bo Yomam V'Layla. The Torah tells us that we have an obligation to study Torah every day. Ki hem chayenu v'orech yameinu, uvahem nehageh Yomam V'Layla. If a person has a very long day and is unable to learn Torah, so maybe they can be considered an anus. Maybe we say, okay, they didn't have a chance, they tried their best, but they weren't able to, they were involved in many important activities. But a person needs to at least think about trying to structure into their day a time for Limud HaTorah. Says the Chafetz Chaim in his Sefer Shem Olam, and he has the same comment in his commentary on Pirkei Avos, where he writes, Ha'adam tzarech lehisonim b'chol yom v'lomar. A person at the end of the day has to make sure that they have a cheshbon hanefesh and think to themselves, did I do a chesed for somebody today? Did I enhance the life of another person today? The same way when I go to sleep every night, I need to ask myself, did I learn some kind of Torah today or not? If the answer is no, then there's something deficient in the day that I had. If I wasn't honest, if I have an excuse, and it's a good and fair excuse, okay. But if not, my day is insufficient, my day is lacking. Writes the Chafetz Chaim, we need to have the same kind of perspective when we talk about Gemilas Chasadim. We need to make sure that we always think at the end of a day, have I inspired someone else's life? Have I enhanced it in any way to give them a better opportunity, to give them a better experience with the Chesed that I have done? Now let's just shift our perspective for a minute and think about why it is that it's so important to be Gomlei Chasadim. Why is it so important that we give of our time to other people, that we invest of ourselves in the lives of others? So the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, a very important Mishnah. It's a Mishnah that is quoted by Hillel. Hillel was one of the Gedolei Hador. Hillel, the Medrash tells us, is one of the 4 personalities that lived an entirely complete life till the age of 120 years old. One of them was Moshe Rabbeinu, one of them was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of them was Hillel HaZaken, and one of them was Rabbi Akiva. 4 great giants, 4 great leaders, but it seems to indicate that Hillel had a complete life that was so invested in doing wonderful things. So the Mishnah says here, Hillel chooses to teach us his important messages for life. And Hillel says the following, Hevemi talmidav shel Aaron, ohev shalom, virodev shalom, ohev es habrios umekarvan laTorah. Hillel says we should all strive, we should all aspire to be people who emulate the way of Aaron HaKohen. Aaron was an ohev shalom. He did everything to bring peace between families, between communities, between spouses, between friends. Virodev shalom. Ohev es habrios umekarvan laTorah. We have to do whatever we can to show people that we appreciate them, that we love them. And in fact, the Gemara says in Masechah Shabbos, 3 different stories that show us how much consideration Hillel had for other people. And perhaps even at times that he was not obligated to do so. Hillel went out of his way, he went above and beyond to show them how much he cared about them and how much he loved them, just for being people. Ohev es habrios, just love people and show them how much you love them. So the Gemara tells us a fascinating story. It says that Hillel and Shammai were contemporaries, and on one occasion, a potential convert walks into the home of Shammai and he says, Rabbi, I know you're a prominent rabbi, do you mind if I ask you a question? He says, yes. Well, I'm thinking about conversion, and I'm very interested in the topic, but before I do so, I'd like to know, how many Torahs are there? It's a strange question. And Shammai turns back to him and he says, how many Torahs are there? Well, we have a Torah shebechsav and a Torah shebal peh. They're all incorporated as part of one whole. But we have a written Torah and we have an oral Torah. And in order to become a convert, you need to be willing to accept both of those components. Well, Shammai turns to him and gives him that response, and this man says, well, I'm very interested in converting, but only if I can leave some of it behind. I only want to accept the written Torah. The rabbis, Torah shebal peh, it's not for me. I don't believe in that. And Shammai says, well, if that's the case, you are not a good potential convert. This is not for you. The man then goes down the block, and he finds Hillel, another towering giant of the generation. And he turns to Hillel and he says, I beg your pardon, Rabbi, can you tell me, how many Torahs are there? Hillel says, well, we have a Torah shebechsav, we have a written Torah, we have a Torah shebal peh, an oral Torah. Well, I'd like to convert with only the acceptance of Torah shebechsav. I'd like to leave behind Torah shebal peh. And Hillel says, no problem, we'll work with you. Come tomorrow morning to my office, 9 o'clock, and I'll have the first session. The man comes and Hillel shows him, he opens up a siddur, he shows him an Aleph, and he says, Aleph makes this sound, and Beis makes that, and Gimel makes this, and Daled makes this sound. And he teaches him the Aleph Beis. And they're reviewing and going over it over and over again. He's testing him. Seems like he really has the ability to pick it up quickly. Hillel says, well, meet me back here tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, for our second lesson. The man comes back the next day, and Hillel opens up the siddur once again. He points to an Aleph, and he tells him a different sound than he told him the day before. Points to a Beis and tells him a different sound than he heard the day before. And the man says, hey, you're confusing me. Yesterday we went through all of this, and you told me one sound. Now you're telling me something else. Which one is it? Hillel said, well, now you appreciate the importance of Torah shebal peh. If you didn't have a teacher, if you didn't have a Rebbe, you would never know how to even read the letters of Aleph Beis. You don't even know the fundamentals of what Torah is built on. You don't even know how to read a word, how to read a sentence, how to read a paragraph or a story in Chumash. And therefore, he said, This is why Torah Shebaal Peh is so critically important to the experience of learning Torah Shebechsav. Just highlights the incredible patience, the incredible sense of understanding and compassion that Hillel had, that he was willing to indulge this man, even though the man was being disrespectful to him, but he was willing to be gracious and considerate to him. He was willing to give him time, even though perhaps this man was not being as nice and respectful as he should have been to one of the towering giants of the generation. The Gemara then says that a potential convert walked into the home of Shammai and he says, I want to become a convert, but in order that I should be able to do that, I want you to do it al regal achas. Just in one moment, make me into a convert while I stand here. And Shammai says, please go away from me. You're just a pain in the neck. I don't want to deal with you. Hillel welcomes him in. Hillel has a conversation with him, and he explains to him what the fundamentals of Torah are all about. And Hillel then was able to motivate him to be a potential convert. And the Gemara then shares a third story. But the point of all of this being, Hillel did not only tell us that we should be caring and sensitive and thoughtful to other people, but Hillel lived this ideal. Hillel understood that this is the only way of life. This is the way he interacted with everyone he came in contact with, even somebody who he never met before, even somebody who was a Gentile and considering conversion. That was enough for Hillel to say, I can give him my time, it is worthwhile for me, and he motivated this person to live a very different lifestyle. Now the Maharal Prague in his commentary on Pirkei Avos wonders, why is it so important to be Ohev Esabrios? Why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to love other people? And the Maharal writes so beautifully, and he ties it into another idea. The Mishnah says, Havedan es kal adam lekapsechus. We have to judge other people favorably. Ask the Maharal why. Why do I have an obligation to judge other people favorably? I see them doing something wrong. Let me assume they're doing something wrong. Why do I have to love other people? I have my family, I have my close friends. Why do I need to love the person that I don't even know so well? And explains the Maharal so beautifully because this is an extension. This is an augmentation of the mitzvah of Ahavas Hashem. We say it in Shema every single day. Ve'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chal levavcha u'b'chal nafshecha v'chal miyodecha. We have an obligation to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What does it mean to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Writes the Maharal, if you love something enough, you love everything that is connected to that person. I say an example often. I married my wife and I love her very much. But her line of business was not at all what I was familiar with. She's a graphic designer. She does beautiful graphics. It's something that when I got married I knew nothing about. But over time, because I have such a deep sense of appreciation for her, I've come to appreciate all that she does as well. I've come to appreciate everything about her. And therefore he says, this is why we have, as an extension of the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, we have an obligation to also love human beings. We have an obligation of Ahavas Yisrael because those are a part of the experience of Ahavas Hashem. You think about it this way. Your children go to school and a teacher calls you up one day and says, I know you're nervous that you're getting a phone call from school, but everything's okay. So why are you calling? Is my son feeling okay? Is my daughter okay? Is there something wrong? Are they making trouble? No. I'm calling because I just want you to know I love your child. Your child is so sweet. Your child is so genuine. Your child is so sincere. Your child has such good midos. They talk so respectfully. And I see what kind of home they grew up in. Whatever it is that the person will say. Is there a teacher in the school that we will love more than that teacher? They may not be the greatest educator. But if somebody loves my child, it means they love me. If somebody loves my child, it means they love me because my child is an extension of who I am. If you love somebody enough, you love everything about that person. And therefore we say that we have an obligation of Ahavas Habrios because it's just part of the obligation that we have of Ahavas Hashem. Part of showing our appreciation for HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to show our appreciation for everything that's connected to Him. And that means showing the Ribono Shel Olam that we not only love Him, but we also love His children. The Chasam Sofer writes in a beautiful drasha that the Navi Yeshaya refers to Avram Avinu as Zera Avraham Ohavi. Avram Avinu is the beloved of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why, asked the Chasam Sofer? Why is Avram Avinu referred to as the beloved of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the Chasam Sofer suggests because Avram Avinu made a decision in his life. He wanted to be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but there were different ways to do that. Up until that point, anyone who wanted to be connected to spirituality would lock themselves up, would sit a life of celibacy by themselves. They didn't want to be involved or integrated in the society because I just need to connect. I need to be spiritual. I need to be left alone so I can just sit and contemplate and have my own cheshbon hanefesh all day and be sitting by myself and thinking about godly matters. I don't have time for the mundane. I don't have time for people in the world. And Avraham Avinu said, no. We're going to have a paradigm shift from here on in. Avraham Avinu taught the world that being connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not mean closing ourselves off and not being involved. Being connected with HaKadosh Baruch Hu can also mean that a person is the greatest Bal Chesed of the generation. That a person is able to see the needs of other people. That they're able to have an open home, an open tent. That they're able to be engaging and inviting to others. That they're able to be sensitive and caring to their needs. And always be thoughtful to whatever it is that the society around them might be lacking. That is why, says the Chasam Sofer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives that divine appellation of Avraham Ohavi. You, Avraham Avinu, of all people, are the most beloved. Why? Because you showed the world that life is not just about connecting myself individually with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Life is about being there for others. Life is about giving of myself to other people. And therefore, if you love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you love His people. And if you love His people, then you love Him. Therefore, writes the Chasam Sofer, the Navi refers to Avraham Avinu as Zera Avraham Ohavi. Let me just close with one final comment, and that is a powerful comment of the Ramchal. The Ramchal was one of the greatest Jewish philosophers. He lived in the beginning of the 1700s. He lived a very short life. He passed away at the age of 40. But in the 40 years of his life, he contributed so much, not only to the Jews of his time and to the Jewish world of his time. The Ramchal contributed so much to generations of Jews who came later. Is there a Jewish library in the world that doesn't have the Mesilas Yesharim and so many other important works of the Ramchal? So everybody who has an office keeps something on their desk. And they choose to keep all kinds of things that are important to them on their desk. Some people have a picture of family, and some people have a picture of teachers or Rebbeim or whoever it might be, an inspiration, parents. Some people have a line, a quote that they once saw. I just have shiurim that I'm preparing here, lots of papers of things that I'm working on. Everybody has something that they keep near and dear to them in their office. There is something that I keep on my desk at all times. And it's because, to me, I find it to be such an instructive comment. And it really gives me direction in every day of my life, every day of my public service, as the privilege of being a Rav in a community. And those are the words of the Ramchal. The Ramchal writes, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu ohev, ela lemi she'ohev es Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves the person who loves other Jews. That is such a powerful statement. V'chol ma she'adam magdil ahavasa liYisrael. And the more that we show we have an appreciation and a sense of love for other Jews, Gam HaKadosh Baruch Hu magdil alav. So too the Ribono Shel Olam will in turn give you that love back. The more we love His children, the more HaKadosh Baruch Hu will come and love us. That is a corresponding reaction of the Ribono Shel Olam. It's all proportional. And says the Ramchal, this is so important for us, and this is what every great Jewish leader has always highlighted, is their sense of understanding and love for every member of their generation. Chesed in general, as we started, is one of the ikarim. It's one of the underpinnings of one of the fundamentals of what meant by a Torah life. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu intend for us when He outlined the life of a Torah Jew? Chesed is so important. Like the Gemara says, even more so than tzedakah. Chesed we can contribute in so many different ways. It's not just with mammon, it's not just with money. Chesed is with guf. Chesed is with neshama. Chesed is giving so much of ourselves to other people in a myriad of different ways. So many endless opportunities that we can have to contribute in different ways to a life of chesed. And loving other people is really at the root of what chesed represents. We do for others because we love them. We do for others because we respect them, because we appreciate who they are. And that is so much a core value of what our experience as religious Jews is meant to be about. Like the Ramchal says, if you love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then you love His children. If you love His children, you'll do for them. And always remember, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. The more that we show Rachmanas, the more that we show our love and compassion for others, the more HaKadosh Baruch Hu will turn around and respond in the very same way to us. Shamra nafshi ki chesed ani. We live at a time right now when we need Shmira, when we need HaKadosh Baruch Hu's protection. Is there a greater way to ask for protection than when we present HaKadosh Baruch Hu with ourselves saying that we are Chasidim? As Rav Hirsch writes, a Chassid means someone who is a selfless human being, somebody who gives to others on a consistent and constant basis. That is what we strive toward. That is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects of us. That is what we should expect of ourselves. And it's so much of what we as a Jewish community strive and aspire toward as well.